For our entire lives, we have been taught a simple and convenient version of the past, one in which people of the 19th century, barely having mastered steam engines and primitive lifting cranes, supposedly built gigantic palaces, temples, and state complexes comparable in scale to modern megacities. But if you are hearing my voice now, it means you are ready to learn what universities, academies of science, and archives closed to ordinary citizens prefer to keep silent about. You were deceived, and this deception has been going on for more than 2 centuries. What are historians hiding? Why do the most monumental structures on the planet look as if they were built by beings for whom today's construction standards would be nothing more than a child's game? And most importantly, who actually left us these architectural traces? Imagine doors as tall as a 3-story building. Imagine columns that even modern engineers would struggle to install without extremely complex mechanisms, requiring computational technology and heavy machinery that, according to official textbooks, simply did not exist in the 19th century. If you look closely at the facades of enormous buildings in former imperial capitals, you will see traces of perfectly precise stone carving, so exact that it resembles industrial laser processing. We are told that all of this was done by craftsmen working by hand, using chisels and simple wooden scaffolding. But ask yourself, could thousands of workers, whose existence is barely reflected in official demographic records, really have created such colossal complexes within the time frames accepted by historians? Where are the calculations? Where are the logistics records? Where is even a hint of how they transported blocks weighing tens of tons through city streets that were not even paved at the time? There are no answers, and this is no coincidence. The deeper I studied ancient city plans, the stronger the feeling became that we are facing a carefully concealed pause in history, as if someone tore out a massive layer of knowledge from our past and then replaced it with a convenient narrative, as if all this monumental architecture emerged naturally, step by step. Yet even basic school-level mathematics shows that the official population statistics simply do not add up. For example, in the mid-19th century, many regions of Europe had populations smaller than those of a modern metropolitan district. And yet those same regions somehow built massive railway stations, cathedrals, government buildings with gigantic domes, and highly sophisticated sewer systems. Something here clearly does not add up. I found archival records claiming that the construction of certain structures supposedly took only a few years. Yet today, to move even a single stone slab weighing tens of tons, a modern construction company relies on powerful cranes, entire teams of specialists, and complex calculations, all with the help of computers. Now compare this with 19th century workers who, according to official history, lived in wooden houses, suffered from a lack of tools, widespread illiteracy, and basic diseases. How, then, were they able to create architecture that we still cannot replicate today? Why does no one ask this question publicly? I searched for an explanation and came to a conclusion that sends chills down my spine. The official version of history was created so that we would never learn who actually possessed the technologies capable of erecting multi-ton structures as if they were ordinary toys. What we are seeing are traces of a civilization that either disappeared as a result of a global catastrophe or was deliberately destroyed. And the most disturbing part is that the deeper I dig, the clearer it becomes that we have been placed in the role of those who are meant only to admire, but never to ask questions. And all of this leads to the central issue. If people of the 19th century could not have built such architecture, then who could? When you begin comparing official data with what can be seen with your own eyes, it feels as if we are looking at a giant chessboard on which someone arranged the pieces after the game was already over. I look at the massive colonnades of former capitals, at palaces with ceilings 3, sometimes 4, human heights tall, at stone blocks that today would require specialized vehicles to transport, and I see one thing. This is not the scale of the human hand of the 19th century. This is the scale of a civilization for which such constructions were the norm, and we merely inherited them, like children who stumble upon an abandoned fortress in the forest and decide that they built it themselves. Think about it. We are told that many of the most complex buildings were constructed in 10, sometimes 15 years. But let us take a simple comparison. A modern construction company, equipped with computer modeling, steel cranes, concrete plants, and heavy lifting platforms, builds a large mid-sized administrative building in roughly 5 to 7 years. And even then, it relies on concrete, lightweight metal structures, prefabricated blocks, and standardized components. Now imagine the 19th century. No electric motors, no construction elevators, no steel frame structures, no welding. And yet we are asked to believe that gigantic buildings with dozens of columns, marble statues, and massive domes were built within similar time frames, sometimes even faster. How? The historian's answer sounds almost mocking: mass labor. But let us check the math. In a number of European regions in the mid-19th century, the urban population barely reached a few tens of thousands of people. Now let us assume that a significant portion of these people was involved in construction. So who, then, was growing the grain? Who was practicing the crafts, running trade, building roads, maintaining cities? And most importantly, who could possibly have been a master of stone carving? Because to carve a perfectly uniform column requires decades of experience and high-quality metal tools, which were rare at the time. Official demographic data dissolves like smoke the moment you start asking a few uncomfortable questions. Now let us move on to what I call the mathematical traces of a past civilization. While studying old city plans, I noticed repeating proportions that do not point to the limitations of 19th century builders, but to a clear system based on unified standards. The same distances between columns, the same facade angles, the same heights of entrance portals. Such consistency is only possible with the existence of a centralized engineering school, and one far older and more advanced than anything that emerged during the Industrial Age. Imagine a network of architects and engineers possessing technologies that allowed them to move multi-ton structures with millimeter precision. Where are their traces? Where are the textbooks? Where are the tools? Why has none of this survived? While instead we are given a legend that everything was built literally by the hands of peasants who had only just migrated to the cities. But the most striking aspect of this mystery is the mismatch between the technological level of construction and the everyday living conditions of that era. How is it possible that a population still walking in wooden clogs created architecture that surpasses the capabilities of the 21st century? Compare ancient palaces whose walls are made of stone several human heights thick with modern government buildings, where even the exterior cladding often begins to fall apart after just 10 years. If the 19th century truly possessed such technologies, why do we not see them anywhere else? Why did a sudden decline occur? Why, after a supposed golden age of construction, did we enter a period in which we can barely maintain what was left to us? It feels like a scenario in which we arrived too late, when the true builders had already disappeared, leaving behind only gigantic stone shells. And all that remains to us are inscriptions, documents, and legends recorded after the civilization had already collapsed. So who built all of this? And why are the traces of that power still being so carefully concealed? The deeper I immersed myself in old archives, the clearer it became. Official history seems to deliberately avoid direct comparisons between dates, technologies, and demographic data. Too many contradictions. Too many miracles where simple logic should suffice. But the most intriguing part began when I came across industrial statistics from the late 19th century. They showed that the production of steel, brick, and cement in certain regions was so minimal that it would barely have been enough to build a couple of blocks of a modern city. And yet we are told that it was precisely during this period that gigantic cathedrals were erected, multi-story administrative centers were built, bridges hundreds of meters long were constructed, and palaces whose area exceeds that of entire villages came into existence. This is not just an error. It points to the fact that the very foundation of the chronology was adjusted to fit a convenient narrative. I began to notice one strange phenomenon that is rarely discussed. Old buildings look as if they were not built, but carved out of solid masses. Take a close look at the facades of some former capitals. Stone walls run in perfectly straight lines, with no visible traces of primitive masonry, no characteristic irregularities of human labor. The wall masses seem to stretch in a single rhythm, as if they were created not brick by brick, but by some far more advanced method. But by what method? We are told that enormous numbers of workers were involved, highly skilled professionals. Fine, but then where are these workers? Why are there no records of massive construction barracks, no specialized schools for stone carvers, no evidence of metal tool production on the necessary scale? Why do we have tens of thousands of pages describing how peasants lived in wooden huts, yet almost nothing about the people who supposedly built the architectural wonders of the world. Now consider another fact. Many gigantic 19th century buildings were already partially destroyed during that very era. In old photographs, we see signs of melting, collapses, columns lying on the ground, as if the buildings had endured not construction, but a catastrophe. How does official history explain this? Construction errors, natural wear, unstable soil. But then why is this, wear observed only in old monumental structures and not in the primitive wooden buildings of the same period? Why did the most complex domes crack while the surrounding shacks remained intact? This looks more like the traces of a shock wave, extreme heat, or some other destructive force. And if these are indeed traces of a catastrophe, then these buildings must have existed long before they were attributed to the 19th century. Now to demography. According to official data, the populations of major cities multiplied several times over within just 1 or 2 decades. But how is that possible if the same period was marked by epidemics, famine, mass migration, and the absence of modern medicine? Moreover, cities appear to have been designed for far more inhabitants than they actually had. Extremely wide streets, gigantic squares, enormous basements and halls, which, according to historians, were supposedly built for small communities of craftsmen and officials. But then why such scale? Why architecture designed to accommodate tens of thousands of people at once if the population at the time of construction was many times smaller? All of this looks far more like the remaining stage sets of a past civilization, one whose population was far larger, more technologically advanced, and more organized than we are accustomed to believing. And the more I compared the numbers, the clearer it became. The gap between reality and the official version is enormous. This is not a mistake. These are traces of history being rewritten. But the most astonishing part was a discovery that completely overturned my understanding of what was happening. I came across documents stating that many old buildings were not built, but restored. Yes, that is exactly how they are described in the reports: restoration, reconstruction, being brought back into usable condition. But how can you restore something that has just been built? This can mean only one thing. These gigantic structures existed long before the time they are officially assigned to, and were simply adapted to a new reality. And this leads to the central question: where did the creators of these structures disappear to, and who today is making sure that we never connect all these dots? I continued gathering scattered fragments of this enormous mosaic, and the picture became increasingly disturbing. The further I went, the stronger the feeling grew that our entire history resembles a vast archive in which half the pages have been torn out, and the remaining ones rewritten to conceal a fundamental truth. That feeling intensified when I compared data on climate, migration, and sudden demographic shifts at the end of the 18th and 19th centuries. It turned out that many regions of the Earth experienced a sharp population decline within a single generation. Yet instead of explaining the causes, historians limit themselves to vague phrases like diseases, wars, or economic hardship. But if you study the documents of that period closely, it becomes clear that no ordinary processes could have led to disappearances on such a massive scale. This looks like the aftermath of a global catastrophe, one whose traces are now carefully disguised as natural change. Compare old photographs with modern ones, and you will notice a strange detail. Most old buildings appear to be buried in the ground. Their lower floors are covered by layers of soil several feet thick. We are told this is the result of natural soil accumulation. But then why did only monumental stone buildings suffer from this accumulation, while later structures standing right next to them did not? I found dozens of images where the first floors of old buildings are almost completely underground, as if, at some point, cities were engulfed by a massive wave of mud or sediment. Yet no textbook mentions this. Why? Because such a catastrophic scenario completely destroys the idea of a continuous, calm, and linear development of human civilization. It clearly shows that between us and the creators of this gigantic architecture lies a vast abyss, filled with an unknown tragedy. And the more I studied ancient structures, the clearer another unsettling thought became. The scale of these buildings does not match human proportions. Entrances twice the height of a human being. Staircases on which an ordinary person feels like a child. Enormous corridors, halls with acoustics seemingly designed for voices of incredible power. Who was all of this built for? For the small populations of the 19th century? For officials educated in wooden schools? For peasants who could barely read and write? Obviously not. These structures were designed for those who were far more numerous, technologically superior, and lived by a completely different way of life. It feels as if today we are living inside architectural suits tailored not for us. Now let us move on to what I call shocking data points. There are documents that list the number of stone blocks used in the construction of certain structures. And here is what is astonishing. In some cases, the volume of material exceeds what an entire region could physically have produced over several decades. To process such quantities of stone by hand would have required hundreds of thousands of stonemasons, people who simply could not have existed in those numbers. There were not enough people, which means one of two things. Either there were technologies capable of processing stone at scales inaccessible to the 19th century, or these materials were quarried, processed, or delivered long before that era. In both cases, the official version collapses. But the most intriguing part is the sudden technological reset that occurs just a few decades later. As if someone needed people to lose the skills and knowledge required to build such structures. Gigantic buildings suddenly stopped being constructed. Architecture became drastically simplified. Thin walls, cheap materials, rapid construction appeared. No more stone giants were built. Why? What happened? Where are the masters who, according to textbooks, created these wonders? Why did their schools, methods, and tools disappear without a trace? It feels as though we are witnessing a civilizational rollback, as if someone pressed a reset button and erased everything that reminded us of former power. And now one more fact, one that is rarely spoken about. In a number of 19th century documents, a strange wording appears. The buildings are described as having been adapted to new requirements. Adapted? To what requirements exactly? If the buildings were newly constructed, why would they need adaptation at all? This is a direct indication that they already existed and simply had to be adjusted to a different culture, different city sizes, and different people. Imagine discovering a gigantic fortress and converting it into a government building. That is precisely what was happening everywhere. We are not the builders. We are the inheritors of ruins. And when you put everything together, demographic collapses, traces of catastrophe, colossal scale, impossible technologies, the absence of tools, and most importantly, the sudden loss of architectural power, the conclusion becomes obvious. Official history conceals the traces of a civilization that vanished almost instantly, but it did not disappear completely. The evidence of its construction stands right in front of us. We have simply grown accustomed to not noticing it. And then a question arises that sends a chill down the spine. If this civilization disappeared, what exactly destroyed it? And most importantly, could it happen again? The closer I came to the final point of my investigation, the clearer it felt. We are living among the remains of a world we are not even allowed to question. The gigantic architectural complexes attributed to 19th century people are not merely a heritage. They are traces of a different era, different technologies, and possibly a different civilization that vanished so suddenly it was as if it had been wiped off the face of the earth in a single blow. And when I tried to trace the moment of this disappearance, I discovered something strange. It is as if there is a break in history, a void lasting 1 or 2 generations. This period is never mentioned directly, yet it is visible in statistics, demography, architecture, and even in the literature of that time. As if between the 18th and 19th centuries, something so massive occurred that its consequences are still hidden beneath layers of the official narrative. Try to look at this without prejudice. At one point, there existed a civilization on this planet capable of erecting enormous stone structures, working with monoliths, and using material processing technologies inaccessible even to us today. Then came a sudden collapse. Destroyed buildings, streets buried under soil, a vanished population, reset technologies, and a few decades later, a sudden growth of cities, an influx of people, the beginning of the industrial age. But who were these people? Where did they come from? Why did they occupy cities that were clearly not built for them? In old photographs from the late 19th century, one thing stands out immediately: an astonishing emptiness. Vast city squares without crowds. Gigantic buildings with only a few random figures nearby, as if the scale of the architecture and the scale of the population simply do not match. Where are the hundreds of thousands of residents? If cities were supposedly growing at such rapid rates, why do the photographs show empty streets, buildings with no signs of activity, enormous bridges without any traffic? It feels as if these cities were already finished, but not yet inhabited. And this completely changes the picture. We were taught that cities grew gradually, step by step, but the images show the opposite. It is as if a civilization was placed into ready-made scenery. And here the most disturbing thought emerges. Perhaps the previous civilization disappeared suddenly, and its place was quickly taken by new populations who occupied the remaining infrastructure, but were unable to recreate it. That would explain why the technologies used to build gigantic monumental structures were not simply forgotten. They were unattainable for the new inhabitants. They lived in a world where walls were thicker than the houses of their ancestors, where doors were taller than their own height, where halls resembled temples designed for a different people. They did not build, they adapted. And this explains the abrupt technological simplification. The new population simply did not know how to reproduce what they had inherited. But then the main question arises: what destroyed the original creators? I found dozens of hints pointing to a catastrophe that may have been global. Some documents described strange phenomena: massive fires with no apparent cause, cities covered by meter-thick layers of sediment, mass population die-offs, abrupt climate shifts. All of this looks like the aftermath of an event that official history prefers to describe as a series of local incidents, even though the scale more closely resembles a global catastrophe. Most likely, this event was what caused the disappearance of those who possessed technologies inaccessible to us. And whatever survived became the foundation for a new, artificially constructed chronology. And here we arrive at the most uncomfortable part. If this truth has been hidden for more than 100 years, there must be a reason. The destruction of old knowledge, the rewriting of history, the creation of a new timeline. None of this looks like a natural process. It looks like an operation to reset civilization. Imagine a world cleared of former knowledge, former technologies, former people. A new era begins, where the population is introduced into a new reality and told that everything around them is their achievement, their history, their progress. But in truth, they live in the shadow of a previous world. And here arises the final question, one that cannot be avoided. If someone has already reset civilization once, what prevents it from happening again? The gigantic architecture around us stands as a reminder that history can be rewritten at any moment, that we are merely temporary inhabitants of a world created by others, and that the grand forces of the past may return or vanish just as suddenly as the current civilization appeared. And suddenly, everything takes on a new meaning. We are not merely investigating a mystery. We are trying to understand where we stand within a vast cycle. Was the 19th century the beginning of a new era? Or was it just another substitution, another layer concealing the true past? What comes next? Who controls history? And most importantly, are we ready to know the answers, if they turn out to be far more terrifying than the lies found in textbooks?